Hello and welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many people brave the cold and the first little bit of snow. My name is Giovanna Scorsone. I'm the Education Manager here at the Aga Khan Museum, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today as we have our very own Bita Pourvash talking to us about the last edition, the first impression, the art of bookbinding. Our mission here at the Aga Khan Museum is to connect cultures through art. And our conversations often have to do with large-scale conversations addressing socio-cultural and technological innovation and trade across vast geographies, so quite big conversations. But always at the heart of it, we're looking at the details that tell a story. And at a museum, we often find those details in the objects. And you know, we often say every object tells a story. And that is all through the simple act of looking at something small and asking a question of it. So today, we're going to see how the tiniest of details that go into the creation of books can have great meaning, and that knowledge can change how we think about our objects in our collection and also the people that made those objects. Now, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the Aga Khan Museum sits, known as Takaranto, and honor the stewardship, past, present, and future of the Huron-Wendat, the Iroquois Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit. It's a good time to remind you to make sure your phones are on silent and that there's no photography or video during the lecture. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Bita Pourvash. Aside from being a wonderful colleague here at the museum as curatorial assistant, Bita is a graduate from the University of Toronto's Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations Department. Prior to joining the museum, she was working on the history of collecting Islamic art in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum, which is included in the forthcoming volume, Canadian Contributions to the Study of Islamic Art and Archaeology. She was a lecturer at York University, Semnan University, and the Higher Education Center for Iranian Heritage. She's author of the entry on bindings that is translated and published in the Encyclopedia Islamica. Please join me in welcoming Bita to the podium.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for coming in this December day. So, as Giovanna kindly said, the title of this lecture today is about the art of bookbinding. The content of the lecture today, we are going to try to talk about the definition, like trying to first say what we mean about the binding itself, like a couple of the terms that we are using, and then the structure of the bindings in general, historic background, like a very short, brief historical background, dating and provenance, and the material that was used in the bindings, and decorative techniques that was used. So these are the major contents of this lecture. So first of all, when we're saying bookbinding, like many other fields, they're like every word they might use in different meanings, and like necessarily they might not have just one meaning. So when we're saying bookbinding, there are two different fields that we might be talk about. One is just the art of not the art, like the technique of sewing like the papers together and make it like to be actually a manuscript, just to make the book. Versus the other one is like trying to protect this manuscript from getting damaged by making a cover for it. So that's actually like bookbinding we can use for either of these ones. But this lecture today is about just making covers. It's not about actually putting the book together. So we are talking about the bindings in this lecture. And then based on this definition, then we have, when we are saying bookbinders, again we have two different people, so like two different craftsmen. So one is like the sahaf, or the one who makes the book, versus the other one is jalsaz or mujallid, who were like making the covers of the book. And this example that we have here from the 17th century album page, actually on the border, it's a very great example because the date is close to the time range that we are talking. So basically we can say that the craftsmen were very close to the setting that we see here. So if we compare these two figures here, it actually shows that the one on top left shows the person who actually makes the cover, versus the other one is the one that makes the book itself. So it's not necessary all the time. They were not necessarily separate. One person could be qualified to do both, but in some settings, in some workshops, there were different people who were doing it. And then these people, they were having like from social status, they were considered to having like a really higher social status. And the reason for that is that, first of all, they were able to read. In order to be able, especially for the Sahaf who put the book together, in order to do that, you should be able to read the book, to make sure that you put the right page next to the other page. So they had the ability to read, and then they had a direct link. They were like working with the actual religious texts, with the Qurans. So that also added to their to their rank or to their status. They were considered people of culture, people of literature. So that's also important for us to know. And then we have this quote which I like. It's from Mir Ali Shir Nabai, who was like a high officer in the court of official in the court of Timurids in 14th century. So, and he said in his book that this particular binder, Maulana Arshi's, his binding shop in the bazaar was a meeting place for the people of the who knows poetry or like people of culture. And apparently this person was not very happy about it because it slows down the business. It was always crowded. So, but it's very nice to know that like that's the type of people who were actually working in that field. And then again, because they were like writing, they know the reading and they know the writing. So we have several treatises about the art of bookbinding, which is great. We have for other arts as well, like for ceramics or a textile. But the amount of treatises that remain that we have about the art of bookbinding is like really more, and it gives us a good in-depth knowledge about how they were doing, what techniques they were using, or like which materials they were having, so which is great. And these are just some examples that I have here for you, like, and I put the different centuries so to know that we have, from all these centuries, we have these sources that state. And even the last one by Yusuf Hussein is all in Persian and it's all in poetry. So he had all his texts about bookbinding written in poetry, which is like amazing to read through. And then I think it was Ibn Badis, I'm not sure if it was Ibn Badis or Sufyani, that he started his treatise saying that the reason that I'm writing is like, I miss good olden days when people like to learn things. The young generation now, they don't like to learn. So now I'm going to write it down, maybe later someone like use it, which is very nice like to see that they had this problem like maybe a couple of 100 years ago. So in case of the structure of the binding, it's important for us to know that it's like a right-to-left system in majority of the cases. If the text is Arabic, Persian, Turkish, or produced in India under the Persian culture, like so it means that it goes from right to left. That's how it's going to read, and then we first read this page, and then we move to this page. So basically, it affects the way that the book was put together, because like if you look at the book, if you compare to a Western book, the front cover of a Western book gonna be the back cover of these books. So it's totally changes the structure of the book itself. So this is an example, and that I can show you. For example, that this is gonna be the front cover, that's the back cover, and then we have the spine. Versus in the Western bookbinding, it's gonna be the other way. For the back and front cover, usually the same pattern, like they were like really close to each other most of the time, the pattern that they were used or the design. However, when we study bookbinding, so like the inside and outside, that's like really major difference. Usually the inside has more delicate material, could be like a more delicate type of a skin or leather, or it can be even like paper inside, so it's more delicate than the outside cover. And then if you want to just compare with the Western bookbinding, besides from the way that it was bound, the direction is like, there's actually no overhang, so the board itself is exactly the same size of the book. So there's no edges around. So that's actually one sign that helps us to know if the binding of a book has been changed or not. So because it should be exactly the same size of the book itself. The spine is flat. and also introduction of an element that we call flap or sartable or lisan. And flap is actually something that is the extension of the back cover of the book, which comes back and fold over itself. It can be come on the top of the book, but usually goes tucked in under the front cover of the book. So this is actually one of our manuscripts that is on display now. Is our Amber Sohaili. So if you open the manuscript, it's going to be like this. So you can see the part of the flap, which is great because when you read, you can also have a sense and see part of the binding as well. And then when you close it, it's going to be it's protect the front edge of the book itself, and it's usually, as you see, it's going to be 1/3 of the actual binding, and it's meets in the center of the book. And that's totally something that comes from the again, another term that I have to explain, from the Islamic culture. When we talk about Islamic manuscript or Islamic culture, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily religious. It's about the objects that have been made in the courts that the ruler of the time was Muslim. So it's not necessarily Quran text. It could be poetry, could be literature, could be science, could be different material. This is another example from Harvard, which then when you look at this flap, because they were usually tucked in, they were protected from light. So they are usually in a better, most of the cases, they're in better, they stay better quality, condition. So if you compare the turban here, you can see the difference, or the faces. So this one really is in a better condition. Or in this example, actually, here I just wanted to show how it looks like if you have if you have a book flat. So that's outside and inside. So if I go here, and if we compare only this part, that's the back side of the book, and that's the flap. If we compare it, you can see the difference of how this one stays better than the other one. Another part of the structure is actually they were not writing the name of the author necessarily directly on the book. Let's say that this is this book, that's the author. It was not like what we do today. Usually if they wanted to mention the name of the patron or the name of the author of the book, they had a twist to it. They used part of the poetry of that person. So by reading that verse, you know, okay, so this verse is from that poet, so that's the author. Or then they will put the information either, so I'm going back to the previous slide. They were putting it it could be the cartouches. Not in this case, their cartouches are very small, but if they were bigger cartouches, they would put it here, or that's the place they put. They wouldn't put it on the actual spine because it's gonna damage very easily. So that's between the back side and then the flap. That's the place that they would put. So in this example, for example, if you rotate it, this is a verse from Nizami. So they put that verse, so by reading it, so you can see, oh, okay, so this is from Nizami, and the text itself should be from that. So a quick note about our collection. So you can see the numbers. So 80 manuscripts we have in the permanent collection, 28 on display, and then 43 detached binding, which is complete or fragment. And here I want to thank our collection manager who pulled all the 43 for me. So really, thank you so much. So when you then probably you have this question, okay, so when I was in the permanent gallery, why I didn't see that many bindings? So why there are only a few of them? And the reason, of course, is because usually when we have a manuscript, we tend to show the actual open manuscript to see the pages, so the bindings are kind of hidden. It's there, it's a treasure, but nobody can see them unless they're detached bindings. And then it happens, for example, if you go to if you see the Bruscotini show, the exhibition, so we have this chance of showing actual closed manuscripts so that people can see the binding, which is really a great opportunity. Or rarely, we might have a binding show like this, which is this is an exhibition in 2011 before the museum and before the objects going to be in our possession. So that was actually the same manuscript. That's this manuscript that has been exhibited like this, which we do not actually recommend. But it rarely happens that you have the opportunity to see the bindings themselves. So if we have a detached cover, which, as I said, we have 43, I think. So detached covers, they can be entirely intact, they can be without the flap, but so they lose their flaps. So if they lose the flaps, then means we can find the flaps later somewhere. So lots of flaps. One cover can survive only, and then the fragment. So all sorts of these, like this is an example. On the left is a flap from our collection, and on the right is from Metropolitan. They have like details. And these fragments, they're all important in the study of the bookbinding. So sometimes even a fragment is more helpful in studying the art of bookbinding rather than even the entire binding. So a brief history of the bookbinding. The first examples survived are from Coptic manuscripts. So Copts are the Egyptian community in Egypt. The Christian community in Egypt. So the first examples from 1st to 6th century are like, because they actually had the first books that are closer to what we know today as books and manuscripts. They were not scrolls, like they're like in the shape that we know today. And then from the early surviving examples of Islamic art goes like around 9th to 10th century, even like Islam came to the region in 7th, around, like we don't have any 7th, 8th century that haven't survived that much. So the early examples are from this day. And for the Persian one, there are very few examples before 14th century. This example here, that was the only image that they had at Museum of Fine Arts. That's one of the examples, early examples that they believe might be Persian, might be Iranian. It's not even 100% confirmed. From after 14th century, we are more confident to say that, okay, this is Iranian and it's not Iranian. And part of the reason is, before 15th century, we can say there was an international style in that region, like saying North Africa, like Syria, and then Iraq, Iran, Turkey. So there was an international style like that, all influenced by the Coptic way of bookbinding. And then we can see the development and then the high peak of it in the art of the Mamluk binding in Egypt. So they mastered that in the 14th, 15th century. Until 15th century, that's the style in all that region. So in all of the book. And then I'm going to mention these names here, and then we go back to them when we talk about, when I show you some examples. So these are the dynasties that I can, we can briefly touch upon and say that in this time we can see huge shifts in the art of the bookbinding in Iran. One is Jalayiri. So and at this time, for the first time, we can see that the bindings show them like a kind of Persianate, like a way of production themselves, and they were actually also influenced by Far Eastern, but then they make it like more Persian. Like they got that influence, but they made it Persianized it. And then the Timuris, they continue doing that, but then they advance themselves really in the technique of making bindings. Safavids make it to another step, especially in using stamps, but then from 17th century there was a decline, I can say. And then in the 19th century, they could really develop the art of lacquer binding, which again, in Safavid, we see the Safavid times there was, we can see great examples, but in Qajar it goes into another, it flourished even further. By dating and provenance, I just want to say it's sometimes very difficult to date these manuscripts, especially because manuscripts tends to travel. That's why one of the reasons that they were produced. If you live in, for example, in somewhere in Europe and wanted to know what that scholar or that scientist said in Egypt or in Iran, you could not Google it or download it. You have to really physically go and get the binding. So the manuscripts tend to travel. So you have to go bring the manuscript. Well, this manuscript might lose its binding, so you have to make a new binding for it. So that's hard when to follow up what is it what this manuscript produced in that time, but it does not necessarily have the same binding as it had 100 years ago. So these are difficulties in tracing dates and provenance. And in some cases, we have bindings that are contemporary to the manuscript, which means they are in the same time. I'm not going to say really original because it's really hard to say that if they were really original. But when you say contemporary, means even if the binding has been changed, it was very close to the time that it was produced, maybe like a 30 years difference. It's not that much. And then one of the examples being our own Anwar Sohaili, which has the contemporary bookbinding. I'm going to show you just some examples from our collection, and also our manuscript of Tazkere. It's been, like you can see, it's been used, but still it's a great binding of its time. It's a great example. And then for other manuscripts, like, as I said, the binding might change during the times. For example, we have this 13th century manuscript from Iraq, but then the binding cannot be earlier than the 16th century. So it's 16th, 17th century. And again, between Iranian and Turkish bookbinding, it's really hard, especially in the 16th, 17th century, to say any difference, especially because the same artist is gonna move to the other court, and then they tend to work at the same court. So it's hard to say the differences sometimes. So we have this 15th century Shahnameh, which has this beautiful 19th century lacquer binding, or like something like this. This is our Shahnameh also on display, which received the 19th century Indian binding. It's not the most glamorous binding, but still it's very important in the history of and provenance of the object, because it shows like where the manuscript was traveled, or like where the previous owner might have acquired it. So even if it's not a very nice binding, but it has lots of information, lots of data that we can use. And then sometimes the binding got repaired. It was so hard to produce a binding that they tried their best just to reuse it. They might just reuse it for another manuscript, or they just repair it. And this example in the permanent gallery is a very unique example to me, because when you look closer, I'm gonna zoom in this part now. So it has a note from the person who repaired it. So actually he had a note saying that this binding was repaired during the best of the holiest hours. In Persian is that as'ad sa'at mutabarik. So like that person put his impression there, and it's very unique to me, and I think that's the only example that I found that the person who repaired it put their kind of a handprint there, not the footprint. And here you can see the signs of repair. For example, these, if you can see these ones that are like a bit embossed, these are letters, and then the rest have been missed. So he painted them. Or he painted them. So part of them are leather, part of them is like he just painted and filled the gaps. So the material is important, that it should be something durable, more durable than the papers themselves. So in the earliest examples, it could be wood. For the time period that we are talking, actually there's usually not wood anymore. It could be hard leather like a camel skin, which is hard enough that it doesn't need a core, it's hard enough itself. But usually they were pasteboard. So pasteboard gives that thickness, that durability, and then you can cover that pasteboard with a nicer material. So that material could be, before we go that, I'm going to talk about the pasteboard for a second, because again, pasteboard are very important, they're like great sources sometimes for studying literature, because they were made of gluing papers together. Sometimes there are hidden sources, like lost sources, that if you can open them, we are not opening them, but if they, by chance they're you can see the writings sometimes come out and different sources come out. So this one probably have been like this, because the person might just cut it and use part of it for another binding. That's why it's in this shape now. But a great example that I can show you is actually this one. That, like in Pakistan in 1950s, Mr. Shafi actually was studying a manuscript and a binding, trying to repair it, I think. And then they saw this page, that they noticed that there's a poetry inside. So when they studied further, they noticed, oh my God, this is Wameq and Azra by Ansari that has been lost for decades. So they, by just in this pasteboard, they found the pieces of evidence of that literature that has been lost, and there were just traces here and there. So they found it, and that is not the only reason that is important, because that piece of literature was like kind of a translation of an earlier Greek example. So by finding that, the Greek example was also lost. So you could find both. So it was like really a great discovery, and it were all just hidden in a cover of a book. So this pasteboard could be covered with a textile, like this example that we have on display here in the Permanent Gallery, Jamal Tabari. Can be covered with the leather, which is the most common material. The most common leather come from sheep, timaj or goat, sakhtiyan, or donkey or horse saghari, which was not common. So the first two are the most common examples. Could be covered with a paper, like this example inside, or just can be used as a canvas to paint on. So you can make it with like some foundation and then just paint on it, which is we call lacquer binding. So for decorative techniques, again we're gonna talk about these techniques: tooling, stamp decoration, filigree, mushabbak, which is mushabbak lacquer, which is saw rohani. And then for gilding and India and only when we're talking about the other things. We don't talk about them that much separately. So tooling is actually basically you have a simple tool and you make an impression on the leather. So this image I got it from Etsy, because I just want to say, like, even today, if you buy a belt or like handmade bag, so that's the same technique. If you want to have an impression on a leather, you should have a tool, and then you make that impression. It can be just cold, which make a lower relief, or you can heat it up and heat it, and then have that impression, which makes more impression. And then it can be very simple. Could be like a dot, a small line, longer line, square, or it can be like a more complicated pattern, like a flower or like different pattern. And if it's a bit larger, then you can have it. You should attach it to a shaft and then use it for impression. Again, this image is from Etsy. But the old tools were also almost like this, and the majority of them were, the best of them were from steel. So in this image, this is not Iranian, this is a Mamluk binding from Egypt or Syria. So in this example, you can see that, for example, they use at least 4 or 5 different kind of tools to make this impression, and just by moving into different direction, you can just make that pattern and that fill the space. So it also has like more complicated. It can get to a really complicated pattern, and there's one example in Chester Beatty that they like estimating it took 2 years to complete. It's a bit overestimate, but like it has 50,000 like blind tool, which means also without the gold, and also 40,000 with the gold. So together it took like they say took years to complete. So again, if I zoom in, you can see that with just this, which we're kind of close to the candy cane, with just having this one in different direction, that's how they just made that pattern. So it's just with the most simple tools. For stamp decoration, it's again the same idea, same kind of technique, but this time, instead of having one tiny tool that you have to repeat like 1,000 times, they just made like a larger stamps that by one impression you can just cover larger area. So if we look at this, for example, they can make a stamp like this, like all these major structure of the pattern, and then they can use them instead of like going one by one, like with the smaller stamps. So these are like an example of a 19th century stamps that they could use easily to cover the surface of the binding. So this example is important because this is from Jalayers that we mentioned before. This is an example of using the larger stamps, And it's important because this is the first time that we have a figure introducing. So this technique allowed the artist, like the craftsman, to introduce like a more complicated pattern this time. So they could introduce figurative style. So this is actually like the whole shape is influenced by the Far East, but the composition that we come close later, like in the century, that shows the Persian culture, and then they mix together, and the outcome is like very interesting, advanced bookbindings. So this is I put this here because that's known as the first example that has been known that has the figurative style and has been used with this technique like this. But as you see, it's very shallow. Like I tried to even enhance a bit of the picture so that we can see the traces of it. It does not allow you to have a deep impression because it's and also after being robbed for several years, the design starts to disappear or like show itself less. So they tried like a couple of ways to make it better, and that really showed the difference in like 50 years or 60 years from this time. We can see the difference. One of the ways that they enhance it is introducing the gold here. So we can see by just adding the gold, the pattern is really starts showing up. And then they can also add some color to it. Like it's when you stamp it, you can put something as basic as an animal fat, and then when you stamp, because they were heat and the stamp, that fat turned to a darker color, so they could make a darker color rather than the actual leather. Or sometimes even just like pigments, paints. You can add some pigment and then just try to make it a different color. In some cases, they might add different layer of leather, which I don't show the example of that one here. So gold is one way, and the gold could be used in two ways. One is like here, as you see, they have a sheet of gold and then they press it, like here, and the other one is just you can start painting in gold. So they were used both examples, but there are differences. So it could be liquid, which they used gold paste for it. And then they had the gold leaf, which they used a mixture of egg white and fat, and then they cover it so that it makes this and stick to the actual leather. And then the leather shouldn't be oily when they were doing it, otherwise it won't stick to the surface. The other technique was to raise some parts of the bookbinding so that it can show itself better. And if you raise it a bit, and then you have the pattern, there's less likely that you rub it up over the time. So it's kind of protect the pattern as well. I took this picture from the side so that it's a bit more visible. Like you can see that these parts have been raised. This is sunken a bit. So these parts have been raised, and it can really get exaggerated. This one is not very raised. It can get really raised. So this is a minimum raised example. So for this case, you can either start cutting. So they were actually what they were doing. Like if you have a pasteboard, they were actually like cutting through the board. So make it sunken in some parts. Or the other way, they can add to it. So they were like, two techniques. One is you start cutting through. You can decide if you want to cut, you want the whole ground to be lower, or you want the pattern, like these shapes, to be lower. You decide. You can either cut here or cut here. Or the other way of doing it was you add some more layers to the parts that you want to come up. So there were two techniques for doing it, but the result was the same. And that's another example. This one is also have turquoise in it, so they added. This is from Metropolitan actually. Well, then you see in less than a century, what is the difference? By adding these two techniques, from this one on the right, we turn to this one, which is, again, this is the binding in the Burskutini exhibition. This is Jalai, this is Timuri, so you see this part is raised, this is sunken, and then it has a gold, and it really shows itself. So in Safavid time, they started using larger stamps. So by larger stamps, so it's even makes it, it's as if you're moving towards more mass production. So it's like now, instead of having like a tiny ones, then to larger one, and here it's even larger. So it now covers like a larger surface, and we can cover everything. So for this part, you can see for this one, if the design has symmetry, they can use half blocks. So you can see this line. So this is the block that they were using. So that was the stamp. So they use it once, they use it again. That's it. With 2 press, they have it everything. They have it all. So how many lines do you see here? Because those lines are important. Those lines are where they show us how this the stamp was actually. So here we see 3 lines, which means that that was the stamp. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have it, and then we continue adding it. So it gets a bit easier here until we move to this, which is like the larger stamp. So you have 1 stamp, use stamp, and done. But creating that stamp was very complicated. But then when you have it, then you can use it for several covers until it's get faded itself, the stamp. But like, it's the importance of this is that it's allow the artist or the person who designed it to really get creative, because then you can have the entire landscape. You couldn't have it before, because like you cannot have animals here and then animals here again in the sky. So you know it's but when we can have just one stamp, we can start from animals, go all the way to the trees and the sky. So you can really have that perspective. So it allowed the artist to be more flexible. On the other side, when we have this advanced in this direction, it means that the art of actual bookbinding, which was with the stamp, diminished a bit. So the actual craft of bookbinding started now, diminishing a bit here. The other technique is filigree. So filigree actually is like cutting out through the leather or paper and pasting it on the inner cover of the book. We have examples on the outer cover, but they were mostly inner cover because they were more sensitive. So if you see that, so these are all cut out. So the first ones and the more complicated ones are cut out leather that have been pasted on the leather. But then when we go further, then they started like changing leather with the paper. So they cut out paper, pasting on the paper, or the later one. But then it's still a matter of question how they would paste it there. Cutting is okay, but then how would they paste it this neatly on these covers? It's still like they're still trying to figure out all the details about it. Or this is an example, like the Quran cover that we have on display. We always see this side, but I mean this is the back side of the same binding that we have in the gallery, which has this great mushabbak here actually, filigree. Or they can combine the techniques, like here. Like here is the stamp, here is the filigree. I'm going back. So you can see that they can also like mix the techniques together. So the last one that we want to talk about today is the lacquer or roghani. So we as I said, it started from 16th century, but it developed itself. We have great examples from 16th, 17th century, but then in the 19th century, in the Qajar art, it goes to like flourished into a different direction. So basically, I summarize it in 4 steps. There are some steps in between, but basically, it's first of all you have to have a surface. This could be a leather or a pasteboard that you have as your canvas, as a surface. Then you cover it with something that gives you that material that you can paint on. It's a chalk or gypsum that you cover that pasteboard with. And then you start painting with a water-based color or pigment. And then you cover it with several layers of varnish. So there's still this debate whether this varnish is actually the same lacquer that was used in Japanese art. Probably not. That's what they call it. They tend to call it Persian lacquer because it's a different material than the Japanese lacquer. So these are some examples from our collection. So this is a great 16th century example that we have that, again, you can see how free the craftsman can get here, because it's just now you have you can start painting, you have the canvas and you can start painting, even though the color, there is some limitation in the case of color, especially because of when you coat it with the lacquer, it might not necessarily, it changed the nature of the color, the pigment. And the earlier examples, they were painting on leather. They will do this on a leather, but because it starts chipping and falling easily, then they tend to later do it only on the pasteboard. And then again, they can they can start doing as many details as they want. They can start painting whatever the imagination tells. Even figures, introducing figures as a human figure, landscape. They can add landscape here, or even the portrait of the person. So you can basically, by this technique, you can add anything that you want to your binding. So this is a portrait of Nasruddin Shah, who was the ruler of the time. And then I want to end this talk by asking this question again, which goes back to the title of this talk, that was it really the last edition? Which I can say yes. It was really the bindings were really not only the last addition to the manuscript, but they were mostly made when everything was finished. You have to have the book finished, and then you can produce the cover. Especially because, again, as I said, they had to be the same size of the book itself. They have to finish the book to know how many pages it has, to know exactly the size, and then you can produce the cover. However, there are notes in the literature, in the primary sources, about such and such famous binder, because they were so skilled in their work, they could you could tell them, but you could tell them exactly how much is the page, how many pages are, or you can tell them the dimension, and they could start working in advance. But usually that rarely would happen. And then in the 19th century, when in the Qajar period, so at that time they started having preset examples. When you want to go to the shop, they would put 20 examples in front of you, and then you could decide, okay, so I want this, I want that, and they probably could start a bit in advance. But usually, in most cases, it's really the last addition to the book. And as the title goes, it really gives us the first impression, because that's when we see before we start reading the book, we actually see the cover. So that's it.